Welcome back to the Last Days Book Club as we continue to read the book I Will Die Free by Noble Alexander with K. Rizzo, a remarkable story dictated by the young pastor Noble Alexander of his life in a Cuban prison where he was determined to fight to stay alive and remain faithful to his Lord inside the very gates of hell. In our last reading, we covered chapters 16 and 17, where two Americans, Tom White and Mel Bailey, were captured when their plane crashed while they were dropping Christian tracts over Cuba. Noble and Tom immediately bonded, and the months they were imprisoned in yet another prison, the combined prison, they worked together whenever they could, conducting worship services, listening to the outside world on a smuggled transistor radio, and even held a communion service. Tom and Mel were eventually released, and in a tearful farewell, Tom promised to work on the outside to secure Noble's release. After they left, the prison director upped the penalty for anyone found with contraband literature. Tom had left a Bible with Noble, and it was discovered, and Noble was sentenced to 30 days in the box, which turned into 90 days. The box was 7 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 3 feet high, and 6 men were forced to squat next to each other in it with the lid closed. At the end of this terrible ordeal, Noble's legs atrophied, and he could not straighten them out. Yet, the guards strapped him to an electric bicycle and ran it for 15 minutes to force his legs to stretch out. The pain was excruciating, but he survived, and some of his Christian brethren established a workout treatment for him, and 45 days later, he could walk again. Within a short period of time, he was caught with a hymnal and sentenced to 45 days in the shower, a torture where he had to stand on the balls of his feet to prevent them from being punctured by nails protruding from the floor, while a steady drip of water hit the same spot on his head continuously, which after a short while felt like a sledgehammer on his head, creating a continuous headache like none he had ever encountered. But he persevered, repeating the Bible verse, "He who endures to the very end, the same shall be saved." When he was finally released, the prison director expected him to be a raving lunatic, as many others had been. But instead, he found a prisoner who smiled at him when the door was opened. God and Noble had won again. We continue our reading today, beginning with chapter 18, entitled Inside Out. It's about 2:30, one of my letters began. Once more, in the middle of glaring sunlight with nothing around me but bars, I have taken the pen, which is the only form I have, to speak to you. The letter, dated January 3rd, 1969, was the last legal letter I sent to my mother. In the early years of my incarceration, the prison officials allowed me to write to family members. Then, I became a plantado, and everything changed. My letters, written on the fragile tissue paper wrapper of Cuban oranges, needed to be smuggled out. While I could no longer receive guests, many of my fellow prisoners could. These guests, strangers at best, risked being caught with contraband to keep our families informed as to our personal condition. Occasionally, a prisoner about to be released also would manage to smuggle out our carefully penned letters. To ensure delivery, we would write the same information a number of times, sending the letters out by many couriers. That way, we believed that at least one copy would make it to its destination. In my letters, I would try to maintain a cheerful, positive attitude, regardless of my present condition, always closing with, "I at present am well. Thanks be to the Almighty." I would draw flowers in the margins to brighten it up. I saw no reason to recite my ills and create further stress and pain for those I loved, since there was little they could do. Whenever the guards discovered one of our mail routes, we invented a new one. Their control tightened until we were forced to use desperate measures. We folded our letters into tight little rectangles, then wrapped them in 3 layers of plastic hoarded for the purpose. Then our letters took a circuitous route from prisoner to prisoner and from one section of the prison to the next. On visiting day, the prisoner who would deliver the letter to his visitor would either swallow it or insert it into his colon in order to get through the search. When the letter reached the dining hall, where the prisoners and visitors met, the outer plastic covering would be removed, revealing the second layer of clean plastic covering. The visitor would then hide the package in the private areas of his or her body in order to get it out of the dining hall and finally out of Cuba. Once out of Castro's reach, the letter would be opened and sent to its true destination. Anyone caught carrying a letter would be tried as a spy, which carried with it a sentence anywhere from 4 to 30 years. Each letter I wrote revived my hopes for freedom. Perhaps this letter would be the trigger that blew a hole in the carefully constructed wall of propaganda Castro and his public relations people had built for the international press. Perhaps this letter would ignite world opinion against the Castro regime and forced the Cuban government to release us. And every time, for more than 22 years, I hoped, I prayed, and nothing happened. But for us, the last thing we could afford was to lose hope. We had to believe that at any moment, something could happen to bring about our release. Faith in God and in our fellow men must be maintained in order to survive. The Christian prisoners were an affront to Fidel Castro's entire communistic philosophy. Whenever we got news that one of our letters had reached the desk of a U.S. congressman, or when some foreign official broadcast our plight over radio or TV, we rejoiced. Inevitably, our interior office would take offense and increase the level of violence toward us. Instead of becoming depressed because of the increased number of beatings or the intensified harassment, we rejoiced over our successes. Someone outside knew about us. Someone cared enough to speak out. We clung to our motto. We were not born in prison, and we are not going to die in prison. Personally, I refuse to let Castro and communism win. I vowed, I will die free. Yet all the time, God's grace, God's power, not any strength or power I might have, made it possible for me to fulfill that vow. Even before my arrest, my mother and my sister Paulina, who lived in Salem, Massachusetts, petitioned government and social agencies to arrange for me to emigrate to the United States. Paulina visited Cuba many times before and after the revolution, trying to arrange for exit visas for Iraida and me. Each time she visited the island, government officials made it more difficult for her to return to the States. On her last visit in 1959, it took her 2 months to arrange for her return trip to Massachusetts. As if prophesying, she warned, "This is no place for you to stay, Noble. You must emigrate before all the escapes are slammed shut." Castro's takeover gave people an excuse for old enemies to settle old scores. If someone didn't like you, they would accuse you of disloyalty to Castro. You would be taken prisoner, often killed. One day, during my sister's visit, guerrilla soldiers wielding machine guns rounded up a number of men from our neighborhood. Herded into a truck like cattle, the stunned men did as they were told, even though they had no idea what crimes they had been accused of. Perhaps one of the men sneezed or made some move. No one knew. Suddenly, a soldier opened fire, killing 7 of the men. Later, the bodies were dumped into a common grave. When Paulina arrived back in the U.S., both she and my mother started campaigning to get Iraida and me out. First, they needed to find a sponsor for us. They appealed to their local church family. Some months before, the church had sponsored a family of East German refugees, but this time, the church turned down their request. My mother and my sister weren't asking the church for funds to pay for our trip, but simply to sign the sponsor form required by immigration. No amount of pleading would change the church board's mind. My sister didn't understand their refusal, except for the fact that at the time, the people in the United States didn't understand the savagery of the new regime. Many Americans didn't even know where the island of Cuba was located. They thought it was somewhere near Hawaii. When their pleas fell on deaf ears at their church, Paulina traveled to Mexico City to plead with the Cubans directly. They turned her away. She petitioned the Swiss and the Czechoslovakian embassies and was turned away. In the following months, they heard of my arrest. Their prayers for my release continued. Paulina stubbornly continued butting against the inertia and reluctance of various government bureaucracies. "What is the reason for his arrest?" she asked of everyone who would listen. "What has he done?" The official Cuban explanation came through the Czech embassy in Washington, D.C. Umberto Noble Alexander was sentenced to 20 years in prison in case number 83/1963 for reasons of activities against the security of the state and imperfect homicide, a reference to the presumed plot to assassinate Fidel Castro. The letter went on to acknowledge the irritation my religious persuasion had become to the Cubans. During his stay in prison, the letter said, he has maintained a negative and disorderly conduct in all aspects, as well as links to terrorist groups. This image did little to encourage support from either the American or the Czechoslovakian governments. Paulina wrote 2 letters to to Senator Edward Kennedy in 1976 and in 1979. She wrote to her congressman, Michael Harrington, and to his successor, North Shore Congressman Nicholas Mavroules, who in turn sought help from the Czechoslovakian government and the U.S. State Department, and she personally badgered the officials at the U.S. State Department. In 1979, when Castro freed 3,500 prisoners, I was told I would be freed. Even though I didn't fully believe I would be released, I wrote to my mother to share the good news. I do hope the good Lord will put his hands in, and very soon we'll see each other in liberty. But in spite of the international pressure, I was not freed. Czech officials told my mother and sister that I was not released because of my intransigence. As a result of the ordeal, my mother became ill, and with each false hope, she worsened. I often wondered if I would ever see her alive again on this earth. Repeatedly, the demons of discouragement surrounded me with clouds of despair, only to have the powers of heaven force them back. Orlando Martinez, a fellow prisoner, was released and made his way to Miami through Costa Rica. He called my mother and sister to tell them that he had seen me and had seen my name on a list of prisoners to be deported. Their hopes soared again. On February 3rd, 1983, my 20-year prison sentence officially ended. However, I had long since given up hope of being released through the normal means. I had seen my friends and brothers build their hopes as the day of their release approached, only to have the prison guards shrug their shoulders and say they could do nothing, after which the prison officials would accuse them of new crimes and extend their sentence. I had decided that despite the government's inhumanity, God didn't want me to waste unnecessary energy on discouragement. He had given me a mission, and he expected me to be about his business. So when my supposed release date arrived, my friends actually had to remind me of the fact. The day came and went without my being released, just as I had expected. I praised God for clouding my memory during the previous ones, thus sparing me the hopelessness that so many of my brothers had suffered. I asked God when I would be released now that my sentence had been served. And he replied, "You will not be released until you have been totally re-educated." I am certain he didn't appreciate my reply. I laughed at his audacity, as I had laughed during the 20 years I had been imprisoned. We prisoners understood the routine all too well. Hostages. Castro used prisoners whose sentences had been served as hostages for negotiation with the United States and other more compassionate countries. He never released a prisoner who hadn't already served his time. With this policy, he won both ways. First, he extracted his pound of flesh from the prisoner, and second, upon releasing prisoners, he received favorable international press. In the meantime, Reverend Willis P. Miller, the pastor of the Lafayette Street United Methodist Church in Salem, Massachusetts, visited my mother and sister to discover why they no longer attended the church. When he learned of my plight, he vowed to do all he could to instigate my release. "I can tell you one thing, Pastor Miller," my sister said. "I know Noble is going to keep on preaching. The only way they'll stop him from doing that is if they kill him." Along with organizing a prayer group, the minister launched a public campaign for my release. Through prayer, publicity, and political effort, we're determined to help obtain the release of this innocent victim of a cruel system, the pastor said. We solicit the help of others who may be interested in bringing about the release of Brother Alexander. After Tom White's release, I sent letters to him in Glendale, California, with the request that he forward them to my mother. On September 1st, 1983, I wrote 2 letters to Tom and 3 to Armando Valladares, a dear friend and a Cuban poet who had spent 22 years himself in Castro's prison. During his imprisonment, he had been paralyzed and was now confined to a wheelchair. A French professor, who had also been imprisoned for a time, agitated for Armando's release, and Armando moved to France following his release. When Tom and Armando learned that Reverend Jesse Jackson was one of the Democratic Party's presidential candidates for 1984, they both forwarded copies of my letter and my prisoner's list to him, along with the following note. Dear Reverend Jackson, we have learned that you're going to Cuba. In Combinado del Este prison, there is a pastor, just like you. He's black, just like you. And he's rotting in Castro's prison because he preaches just like you. See if you can do something for him. In my letter to my family, I had told about the plight of the plantados, and I included a list of names of those of us who had completed our sentences but were still being held prisoners. Then I waited, hoped, and continued on with my ministry, not knowing whether any of the copies would ever reach their destination. I still had Bible texts to write out, worships to conduct, classes to teach, and precious souls to prepare for baptism. Even though I could not know it, beyond those gray foreboding walls, many people did know about me. A storm of protest grew from many parts of the world demanding my release. By any law, Cuban or otherwise, I had served my prison term. Guilty or innocent of the charges against me, justice demanded I be set free. In the dark of the night, when I felt surrounded by insanity and the sane world seemed eternities away, I reminded myself over and over again, I was born free, and I will die free. Even before the prison on the ground learned of Jackson's intended negotiations with Castro regarding the Americans being held in Cuban prisons, we prisoners knew something big was up. Tension filled the air as rumors about visiting VIPs flew from cell to cell and gallery to gallery. Did you know that they have guards out front painting walls? One prisoner sneered. You're kidding, I replied. I wondered if I'd heard him right. Guards painting the walls? This must be something really big if the government was going to the trouble to whitewash the walls. Whitewash their lives, maybe, but never the prison walls. Yeah, the walls, the inmate assured me. They're painting them green and yellow. Only the ones that will be seen, you understand. Of course, I chuckled. Aloud, I could poke fun at the cosmetic changes taking place, and at Castro and his facade of goodwill. Inwardly, my hopes of a possible release grew, no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise. And I could tell by looking in the eyes of my fellow plantados that they rode the same cruel roller coaster from elation to despair and back again. More information filtered into the gallery during the day. The VIP is the American Reverend Jesse James, a fellow inmate whispered. Jesse James, huh? I grunted. Months earlier, we had all heard of the famous black preacher and politician Jesse Jackson, and thought of him as a kind of a political bandit, hence the nickname Jesse James. So maybe the black preacher is coming here to get another black minister, my friends teased. I laughed along at their chiding, daring not to hope too much. Early Tuesday morning, the golden and orange streaks of morning hadn't cleared the horizon before we heard the public address system click on, followed by the usual squawk and screech. The following prisoners are to line up, and a list of names was read. Oh, one of the plantados grunted and turned away. They're all re-education prisoners. Despite knowing that my name would not be on the list, I listened. You men, the guard explained, have been chosen to play baseball for our visitors today. I shook my head in disgust. I knew this routine well. Castro loved baseball, America's favorite sport. Growing up in the Oriente province, he played with the local team against neighboring towns. And since baseball was one of America's favorite sports, he used it to demonstrate to the visiting VIPs just how successful his re-education plan had become. Like trained monkeys, the prisoners played their little game for the VIPs, after which it was back to the cells with the prisoners and back to the mothballs with the uniforms. At the same time, family members of the inmates would be beaten and driven away from the front gate to prevent them from telling the visiting dignitaries of our true condition, that many of them hadn't seen their imprisoned loved ones for 5 or 10 years. Now follow me and make it snappy, the guard ordered. I watched as the guards led the visitors' team, as we called them, out of the gallery, wondering, as I had so often during the last 22 years, whether these guards had to go through extensive training to learn how to shout, bellow, bully, and curse. They sounded so much alike. At home, did they shout the same cruelties at their wives and children as they shouted at work? I had heard that some practiced what they called a 5-minute hatred routine. Those of us not included in the ball game found places on the upper floors of the gallery where we could watch the game. After a few minutes, the ball players ran onto the field, clad in complete regulation baseball uniforms, right down to the striped socks and cleat shoes. The players divided into teams. By the way the guards continued shouting, "Hurry up! Make it snappy!" I assumed that the visiting dignitaries must be arriving momentarily. When the players took their positions on the field, the lieutenant in charge shouted, "Play ball!" I had to admit that the game looked authentic enough to the unseasoned eye, and from a distance. Up close, the visitors would have seen a group of 6 starving men playing out a macabre charade choreographed by a madman. The first batter stepped up to the plate and waited for the pitch. Strike 1! On the next pitch, the batter hit a grounder and reached first base. The second batter, then the third, and the fourth took their turns up to bat. The team switched places after the shortstop caught the 7th batter's pop-up. 1 innings, 2 innings, 3, 4, 5, 6, they played ball. 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, they played ball. The fiery tropical sun lifted off the eastern horizon and climbed into the sky overhead. Sweat poured down their foreheads, necks, and backs, soaking the brand new uniforms. Yet they continued to play ball. In spite of the 25-gallon plastic jugs of ice water and lemonade and the box of Spam sandwiches, the players staggered from heat and exhaustion. When one fell, another was sent to take his position. For those of us watching, our earlier envy at getting to play ball soon turned to pity. Exhausted, their necks, faces, and arms reddened, scorched by the sun. Out to the field, chase the ball, catch it, throw it to first, tag the runner, 3 out, and up to bat again. Hit a fly ball, run to first, get tagged on second, 3 outs, and back into the field again. The teams played 70 complete innings before a 4-car motorcade entered the prison grounds and cruised by the playing field. Those of us still watching from the windows craned our necks to see the procession. Jackson's supposed to be in one of those cars, one of the prisoners near me confided. The ball teams played on as the VIPs inched by. The moment the last car disappeared beyond the prison's barbed wire, the guards called an end to the torturous day at the ballpark. "That's enough," the lieutenant in charge shouted. "You will exchange your baseball uniforms for your prison uniforms and return to your gallery." The next morning, one of the plantados sat watching the courtyard from our 4th-floor window. "Hey, come look," he shouted to the rest of us. "They're rounding up all of the American prisoners." I joined the herd of prisoners at the window to watch the guards march the Americans from their gallery. In the 4 hours that followed, rumors swept through the prison complex with hurricane fury. Jesse Jackson is negotiating their release. "Oh, Father," I prayed as I watched and listened for their return. "Please, could this be the time?" With anguish, I added, "Not my will, but thine alone." Amen. As the hours dragged by, I returned to my bunk where I could be alone with my thoughts. Suddenly a shout went up. "They're bringing them back!" Repeated again and again, the cry echoed from one prisoner to the next and from one gallery to the next. I leaped from my bunk and rushed to the windows. As the Americans marched by, their faces glowed with happiness. They grinned toward us and signaled in code, "We're being released. Probably some of you will, too." We grinned back and gave a thumbs-up signal that we had received their message. My roller coaster ride took on a note of wild frenzy. All the while, I hoped, I tried to prepare myself for disappointment. The end of chapter 18 of I Will Die Free. Chapter 19, entitled Promise of Freedom. I sat on the edge of my bunk, thinking about the day's events and what they might mean for me. I glanced around at my brothers. I knew that our thoughts paralleled one another's. Some men huddled together, discussing the good news, while others found a quiet little space to contemplate and digest the changes taking place. Each of us wondered, is it only a matter of time, and I'll be wearing normal clothes again, eating food not riddled with vermin or rotting with age? Will I be able to walk down a street unshackled, amble along a beach at will, laugh, cry, and celebrate holidays with my family once again? The next morning, after the guards returned the American prisoners to their cells, a silence fell over our cell block. A contingency of high-ranking Cuban officers entered the gallery. Stony-faced, the top brass of the military secret service strutted past our cells, eyeing us suspiciously. They'd been sent to check to be certain we had no idea what was about to happen. 5 minutes later, we snapped to the attention at the sudden boom of the public address system. At the same time, General Laiba, the Interior Minister, and his staff entered the gallery. "Guards!" the loudspeaker crackled and hissed as the general's aide ordered the guards to open all cell doors in our section. "Assemble the prisoners in front of the laundry room and dining hall," he announced. We scrambled to obey. Now was not the time to incite a guard to violence, not with the possibility of release within our reach. Wide-eyed and terrified that something might yet go wrong, we stood at attention before the general. My breath caught in my throat as the implications of the general's words sunk into my being. With all the pomp and authority of the revolution in his voice, the general adjusted his spectacles on the end of his nose, then announced, "You are to be released and deported to the United States. The Cuban government has decided to do this as a humanitarian gesture." We later learned that when Jesse Jackson finished negotiating for the Americans held in Cuban prisons, he asked about us, the plantados. At first, the Cuban dictator acted as if he hadn't understood the question clearly. But when Jackson began reading the names, dates, and locations of the plantados from the list I had written, Castro recognized that he could not hide his tyranny from Reverend Jackson and the Western world any longer. So, cloaking his decision in rhetoric, Castro finally agreed to our release as a humanitarian gesture. A humanitarian gesture to release prisoners who had already completed more than their sentence? I wasn't complaining, just cynical over his word choice. I longed to believe in my good fortune, but I'd been disappointed by many such empty promises over the years. True, this time, the events of the day made it all seem more real than in the past. I snapped back to attention when the general continued with his instructions. "The water will be turned on to allow you to shower. After you shower, pack your belongings. We'll be back for you in 2 or 3 hours." The general adjusted his glasses one more time, sniffed disdainfully, then strode out of the gallery, his entourage of officers imitating his style of departure. After the officials disappeared from view, the guards dismissed us. The water pipes throughout our cell block gurgled and chugged with the unfamiliar pressure of water surging through them as we dashed for the showers. All along the pipeline, faucets roared to life. At first, the water, red with rust, poured out of the seldom used pipes, but no one cared or noticed. "It's happening, Lord," I dared to whisper as the cool, refreshing water cascaded over my sunburned body. "It is really happening." I rushed through my shower and returned to my cell, all the while thinking ahead to the next thing I must do. My Bible. I can't leave my Bible. The picture Mel gave me of his family, I want to take that with me too. I mentally went through my meager list of belongings as I dressed in a pair of fresh, homemade underwear, my official wardrobe during the last 17 years. I must say goodbye to, and I began thinking of the names of my brothers in Christ whom I needed to speak with before leaving. Then I mentally listed the names of those whom I had been studying the Bible with, those who were on the verge of accepting Christ. And someone will take over the running of the church, perhaps Brother Fernandez or Valdez Cancillo, Jose Carreño or Luis Rodriguez. Either would do an excellent job. I had so much to do in the next 2 hours. I dared not waste a minute. I had barely returned from my shower when the general and his staff re-entered the gallery. What? I stood up and turned around at the sound of my name being called over the loudspeaker. It had only been 15 minutes since they had left. "You will now be taken to a room where you will shave and be photographed," the general announced. It is happening. It is really happening. Reality gripped my heart. What if it was just another game to break our spirit? I immediately pushed that thought aside. I couldn't allow myself to think that way, not now. It had to be real. It just had to be. The general and his subordinate officers led us to the main floor and to a hastily prepared photo studio. 5 white shirts, black jackets, and black neckties lay atop a folding table. "You will take turns shaving, dressing, and having your photo taken. After your picture is taken, remove the garments for the next prisoner," the general explained. 26 men, varying in size from 5 foot 5 inches to more than 6 feet tall, took their turns wearing the ill-fitting shirts and jackets. No one had bothered to include trousers, since we would be photographed only from the chest up. When my turn came, I put on the shirt and buttoned it as best as I could, since the shirt must have been made for a man with a much slighter build. The jacket, on the other hand, draped across my shoulders like a graduation robe. We laughed good-naturedly at the ludicrous picture we must have created as we shuffled jackets and shirts back and forth. What a bizarre ending to 22 years of torture. But at that moment, none of us worried about the cut of a jacket or the width of a tie. We were anticipating the heady thrill of freedom. After they photographed the last prisoner, a guard collected the clothing and left the room, and a second guard ordered us to follow him. A myriad of thoughts bombarded my mind as I fell into step. What could possibly come next? What other games would they force us to play before we would be totally and irreversibly free men? I swallowed hard to control my excitement. The hours of that day passed quickly, yet dragged unendingly for me. At nightfall, the guards took 20 of us to building number 3 and to a large empty room where 6 of our plantado brethren from another gallery waited. While we had spoken to them often over the years, we had not seen them for quite some time. There were no sheets or blankets, only clean new bunks with fresh mattresses and equally new pillows. While the accommodations were hardly the Waldorf Astoria, to me they ran a close second. I had just chosen a bunk and laid down when another set of high-ranking officers arrived and outlined the situation for us again. "The hour is late. You men should get as much sleep as possible, as tomorrow will be a tiring day for you. In the meantime, we'll be getting your passports and exit visas in order." After the military men exited, and I heard the lock on the door click shut, I talked with my brothers from Gallery B for a few minutes, then settled down to sleep. It had been an exhausting day. I closed my eyes for a moment as I struggled to create order out of the chaotic jumble of emotions, memories, and hopes bombarding my brain. I couldn't sleep. So much had happened. Again, dozens of questions bounced around in my mind. Questions for the immediate future, the distant future, and the past. My life was changing faster than I ever imagined possible. The United States. Was it as great as Paulina claimed? How would I adjust to freedom after living almost half my life behind bars? At 4:30 the next morning, a guard unlocked the door and announced, "Dress quickly for breakfast." I scrambled to my feet and gathered up what personal belongings I had carried from my cell the day before. The 25 other plantados did the same thing. Noticing what we were doing, the officer politely suggested, "Just leave all your possessions here until after you've eaten breakfast. You'll have time then to pack everything you wish to take with you." We formed a line and marched out of building number 3 into the early morning sunlight. We heard the door close and the guards snap the padlock shut. Without looking at the guard's face, we knew we had been suckered once again. How foolish, I groaned. I believed him when he said we'd be allowed to return for our things. Hadn't I learned anything in 22 years? We turned to glance back toward the pitiful little possessions we had treasured that had given us courage over the years, now snatched from us forever, only to have one of the guards shout, "Get moving! Snap to it!" Instead of heading toward the dining area, the prison guards marched on each side of us from building number 3 across the prison compound to headquarters. While we waited at headquarters, we shared our prison experiences with one another. The hunger strike at La Cabana, the beating and killing during the Black September at Pinar del Rio, the genocide at Boniato prison, the Isle of Pines, Cuba's equivalent to Siberia, and our testimony of faith on the fire. We had gone through so much together, and now we faced a new destiny alone. A new team of officers arrived. The lieutenant in charge ordered us to strip out of our homemade undershorts. They were careful that we left the prison and Cuba with no prison memorabilia that might be used as evidence against them. As you leave this room, continue marching past the guards, the officer in charge ordered. Do not stop walking at any time. At the far end of the line, a military bus will be waiting and an officer will check your identity. The first guard handed me a pair of undershorts. The second guard handed me an undershirt. The next, socks. The fourth, a shirt. Size didn't matter. Big or small, you took the garment and kept walking. If the garment was too big, that was your problem. You could change with another prisoner after you boarded the bus. The fifth guard shoved a pair of pants into my hands. The sixth, a belt. The seventh guard dumped a pair of shoes atop my mountain of clothing and waved me on. A lieutenant and 4 petty officers waited at the bus. Name, he shouted, Umberto Noble Alexander. Number 31450, I replied. Date of birth, February 12, 1934. Place of birth, San German, Oriente. The identity checked sounded strangely familiar, like the one I went through the night of my arrest. Mother's name, Beryl. Father's, Christopher. He completed his list of questions, then ordered me to board the waiting bus. The vehicle had been specially prepared to prevent the passengers from seeing out of the windows and any curious passers-by from looking in. Once on board, another officer took a second roll call. Then a third questioned each of us individually, going through the long list of questions the officer outside the bus had just asked. After the third questioning, the G2 men boarded the bus and made their way to the reserved section at the back. Though I didn't look, I knew from experience that they held their gun hands poised and ready should any trouble erupt. The bus grunted and sputtered to life. A sigh of relief swept through the bus as it cleared the last guardhouse and turned onto the busy street. Out of the corner of my eye, I glanced toward the steely-faced G2 men behind me. A motorcycle policeman preceded the bus, and 2 patrol cars followed. After what seemed like the longest ride I'd ever taken, the bus slowed down. We inched our way through Havana's heavy midday traffic to G2 headquarters. Guards hustled us off the bus and into a large reception room where a number of relatives waited. For most of us, no one was waiting, since the families of prisoners from the other end of the island would not have had time to learn of our release and make the 1,000-mile trip to the capital city. We consoled ourselves, knowing that our reunion would wait until we could greet one another in another land, a free land. After a short time, the officer in charge ordered the family members to leave and instructed us to reboard the bus, where we again went through the roll call and interrogation process. The bus inched out into the busy traffic toward Jose Marti Airport. Our procession snaked through the crooked, winding back streets of the city in order to avoid stirring up the interest of the local population. Once the bus eased past the airport gates and onto the concrete runway, the driver killed the engine. Under the noonday sun, the temperature in the bus climbed swiftly. I glanced at my seatmate as I wiped my shirt sleeve across my face and neck. Tiny black dots danced before my eyes. The excitement of the last few hours and the intense heat were threatening to do me in. I took a slow, deep breath and prayed, "Oh, Father, don't let something happen to me now, not this close to freedom." I glanced out of the corner of my eye at the G2 men in the back and smiled. They were wiping their brows and necks with government regulation handkerchiefs. Good, I thought. At least they're just as uncomfortable as we are. As 1 hour melted into the next, my mouth dried out from thirst. I kept licking my lips, but to no avail. One last test. Always one last test, I thought. The difference between this time and times in the past when we'd been forced to wait in the sun was that the guards allowed us to talk to one another. However, with the G2 men so close, no one wanted to risk saying anything that might jeopardize his release. We had lots to say, but not until we reached Washington, D.C. After filling out a couple of documents for the Cuban government, we lapsed into an uncomfortable silence. We waited for 4 hours for Jackson's plane to land. During the hours, while the Cuban government processed our release, he had flown to Nicaragua on a second mission for the U.S. government. At 7 that evening, 2 jets, 1 American, 1 Cuban, touched down. I could feel the excitement in the bus escalate as the 2 jets taxied over to the terminal. When they had come to a stop, the motorcycle policeman revved up his engine and signaled for our bus to follow him onto the field, where we waited for another hour while the ground crew serviced and refueled the 2 planes. Our anxiety levels soared when a high-ranking Cuban officer and one of Jesse Jackson's associates climbed aboard the bus. The American introduced himself and delivered greetings from Jesse Jackson. "Reverend Jackson will meet with you all when we reach Washington," he explained. Then he relaxed and smiled. "Reverend Jackson wishes each of you a smooth flight, gentlemen." In contrast, the sober-faced Cuban official explained the flight procedures in abrupt, clipped tones as if he uttered each word on the protest. "All Americans will board the American jet except for the following." He read off the names of 4 Americans. "And all Cuban nationals will board the Cuban airline except for the following." He read off the names of 4 Cubans. He went on to explain that the 8 individuals mentioned would switch planes. The 4 Cubans would fly in the American jet, and the 4 Americans would fly home in the Cuban airliner. "You will now exit the bus in an orderly fashion and board your respective planes." I stood to my feet and stretched. It felt good to stand again after sitting in one position for so many hours. I stepped down from the bus and felt the cool evening trade winds refresh my wilted energy. I walked across the concrete and climbed the long staircase leading to freedom. Stepping inside the plane, I found an empty seat. The usual murmur of passengers searching for and adjusting their seatbelts could be heard throughout the cabin. By closing one's eyes, one could almost think that this was just an everyday flight on an everyday plane. I buckled my seatbelt and glanced out the window. Tears swam in my eyes as the plane's 4 jet engines roared to life. It was happening. It was truly happening. For the first time in 22 years, no uniformed guard or officer hovered, shouted, prodded, cursed, or swore at me. The end of chapter 19 of I will die free.